Okay, so here was our agenda. I have questions. Oh, and we're going to talk about next steps a little bit at the end too. Lynn especially will take on some of that next steps. So Methodist Structure 101. Wanted you first to know that all the information that we're talking about today is found either in the Book of Discipline or the guidelines. If you have not heard of the guidelines, it is a booklet that the Methodist denomination puts together for all of the common committees in the church. And it talks about your purpose, your role, and how you work with other committees. Parts of them can be really good. And so if you don't have copies of the guidelines, we can get you those. It's all electronic now. There are paper copies, but we have PDFs of them. So everything I'm pulling out of is actually found in the Book of Discipline and the 2016 guidelines, which we can get to folks as well. Local church, it provides the most significant arena through which disciple making occurs. The local church is the primary unit of ministry in the United Methodist Church. And so a lot of our Book of Discipline, a lot of what we do is really all about what happens in the local church. And so local church, clergy and laity, clergy leadership and lay leadership. You have two elders, one ordained and one provisional. Ken is on his way to ordained elder, still is considered an elder. Cross fingers, do a prayer. Ken will get there. Elders in the United Methodist Church are ordained to word, sacrament, service, and order. And order is really what we're talking about today. The elders are ordained to order the life of the church for the service in ministry and mission. Lynn, as a senior pastor, has the primary responsibility of order of the local church. And Ken, as an associate, also is ordained to order. So not only do they administer the sacraments, preach, and teach, they are responsible for leading the church in partnership with the laity. The Methodist system is grounded in strong lay leadership. I'm going to actually stop sharing for a minute. We go back and forth with itinerancy. Some churches love it, some churches hate it. Itinerancy is the movement of clergy around our denomination, our annual conference. It used to be that an average clergy person moved every 3 to 5 years. Really, way back, it was every 2 to 3 years. Clergy could expect to move about every 3 years. Now we're getting 5 to 7 years. Senior pastors in larger churches usually stay a little bit longer, not always. The reason that the Methodist Church has that is for strong lay leadership. Methodist congregations are not supposed to be based around your clergy person. They are supposed to be based around the congregation. So you might see a lot of other churches where you have a clergy person who's there 20, 30, 40 years. If you grew up in a different denomination, that might be quite common where you've seen that. What often happens is when that clergy person leaves, a congregation really struggles. In the United Methodist Church, we are based on strong lay leadership, which goes into how we structure our committees, which is why I mentioned this. Our committee structure is really about strong lay leadership and the laity working together. To the point, this isn't really true, but in theory, that you could pluck out a pastor, put in a new one, and the congregation doesn't skip a beat. If you have really strong lay leadership, in some churches, that really does happen. Clergy transitions, the church doesn't miss a beat because you know your mission, you know your ministry values, and you have strong lay leadership that keep things going in between pastoral transitions. So the structure of the church and the way that the committees work together are all about strong lay leadership. It is one of the primary foundations of United Methodist local churches. So let me get back. So in everything that we do, clergy and laity are on an equal footing. When we go to annual conference, we have the same number of clergy as we do laity voting. When we go to general conference, we have the same number of clergy as laity voting. The same is true in theory in a United Methodist Church. Clergy have authority to make some decisions without the laity. There are a few things clergy can do. No one can tell Lynn or Ken what they preach on. The pulpit, your clergy person has sole authority for what is said in the pulpit. Nobody can say what you should or shouldn't be preaching on. The clergy person can actually override trustees and church council on a couple of things. But those are very specific matters that ideally we never really get to because you have good working relationships. So here's a very basic structure of committees in a local United Methodist Church. Every church is a little different, and so this doesn't necessarily touch on what's unique to Hope. This is a very basic kind of structure. I could have put on there God, Holy Spirit on the top. I'm assuming we all kind of know that one. Then you have annual conference, district, going down to the charge conference. Your charge conference, the meeting that we have once a year, sometimes more based on decisions. The charge conference is the place where decisions are made for the entire church. The charge conference has authority kind of over everything. During the year then, what decisions are made at church conference are lived out with the pastor and the church council. Pastors and church councils then structure the life of the church throughout the year. Most churches should have a lay leader or multiple lay leaders, a lay member to annual conference, finance and stewardship. Sometimes those can be different committees, sometimes they're the same. You have a nominations or lay leadership committee. It's, by the way, the only committee that the pastor chairs. Lay leadership, only committee that the pastor chairs. And per book of discipline, the pastor is the chair of the nominations lay leadership committee. You have SPR and you have trustees. Those are the administrative committees. And then your mission or your ministry area committees are down below: mission and outreach, UMW, adult ministry, children's ministry, care team, youth ministry, United Methodist Men. And my bubble is hid by all of you, music. Basic structure of a United Methodist Church. Depending on how you have your church council, you also have members from lay leader, lay member, finance, nominations, SPR, trustees, and then those other bubbles are folks who often serve on church council as well. Any questions about just kind of this basic structure? I can't see you all, so just unmute if you have a question.
What is AC?
Oh, sorry, annual conference. That's the annual conference meeting once a year. So you have a lay member, you have one lay member per or appointed clergy. So Hope would have 2 representatives at the annual conference meeting because you have 2 appointed clergy. Lay leaders are an interesting category in and of themselves because lay leaders then also represent all of these other teams. So usually you have a lay leader, and if you have 2, then you have the co-lay leaders split up, who sits on finance, who sits on nominations, who sits on SPR, who sits on trustees. They both sit on church council. Lay leaders can kind of vote in everything. The lay leaders are really the representative of the church. I'm going to get into all of these a bit more specifically in just a minute, but this is a very basic structure. And then you have your staff, and the pastors are the supervisors of the staff, and every church staffs differently. So I wasn't even going to try to do a basic staffing structure.
Hey, Jessica, what's the significance of red versus blue, green, and tan?
It was colorful. So, I mean, yes and no. So annual conference, charge conference, pastors, church council, that's kind of the primary leadership. The pastor and the church council are your primary leadership of a church. So that's why it's in red. And they're the ones who directly work with the district superintendents, with the bishop, at the district level, conference level, and then charge conference is that primary authority of the church. So you do think of that kind of as the top leadership in red. The blue is all of your elected leaders in the church. UMW is not necessarily elected. Sometimes you have folks on some of the ministry areas that you don't have to elect, but especially those 6 in the middle, lay leader, lay member, finance, nominations, SPR, trustees, you elect those folks every year. They are your elected leadership. And so they're kind of at that level. And then that bottom level is your ministry area teams that churches really have a lot of freedom to do all kinds of different stuff with. And then staff, because they're paid staff, they're a whole category in their own. Sometimes staff are not allowed to vote on things because it's a conflict of interest because they're getting paid by the church. Sometimes they are. That's kind of different. And then the kind of yellow circles are members of church council that aren't necessarily a part of this other blue leadership.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.
I would like to have a copy of that sometime.
You will. All of this will be sent to Lynn and she can send it out to everybody. So this will be public. I think she said we'll put it on your website. It's not final today because I'm going to make tweaks based on anything that happens today and then send a final version after.
Jessica,
Yes.
how are the at-large members to the annual conference selected in this conference?
So that is part of the nominations team. So the nominations lay leadership recruits folks for all of these bubbles. And they also recruit for a lay member to annual conference.
No, the at-large members.
Oh, the at-large members to church council?
No, the at-large members to the annual conference.
Yeah, so that's recruited by the nominations team as well in conjunction with the clergy person usually. So those folks are invited to serve in that way if they want, and they are elected at church conference.
You're talking here about each church has one lay member per appointed person.
Right.
There are more clergy than there are churches with nominations. So there are some at-large members.
Oh, the equalization members.
That's what I'm getting at.
Yes,
Yeah.
the equalization members. Sorry, Larry, I wasn't understanding that. So the equalization members, what that means is we have retired clergy, we have clergy serving in extension ministry, we have a number of clergy where that's not an equal balance between clergy and laity. And so the district invites folks from different churches to serve as equalization members to annual conference. So we have our district gathering on March 5th. It'll be Zoom. Well, no, it'll be in person. It'll be in person at Lakewood United Methodist Church on the morning of Saturday, March 5th. And at that meeting, we'll invite folks to consider if they want to be an equalization member to annual conference. We'll also be sending information out to clergy if they have folks in their churches. And then that group of people are nominated by the district roundtable.
Does each district have a certain number that it is?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
How is that determined?
That's quite the process at the conference level. They have to look at how many retired clergy and how many extension ministry clergy are connected to churches in that district.
Okay.
And then we get an overall number. And then we look at how many laity serve on different conference and district teams.
Okay.
And they kind of get subtracted from that number. And then we have a number of 50 that we have to go into the local churches and find those folks.
Okay. Thank you.
Yeah. So one thing you should know about me is I am a Methodist nerd. Lynn said she was hesitant to call me that. I fully self-identify. I'm a Methodist nerd. I could talk about this stuff for hours. So I try really hard not to, because I know you all don't want to spend hours talking about all this, but I love it. So any questions that you have, or if you have questions or want to have conversation more deeply about any of this, you can always reach out to me, and I am more than willing to talk district, conference, general church at any time. But yeah, I never thought to even bring in the equalization members. So thank you for that. question?
Jessica,
Yeah.
the question that I'm asked the most that I never remember, I'm so bad at remembering numbers, is how many churches do we have in our conference and how many churches do we have in our district? Just to get an idea of scope and variety of different kinds of structures and different applications of discipline.
Right.
What are our numbers?
What are the numbers? Real quick, Jerry, I think I called you Larry. Sorry.
It's okay.
Um,
I've been called other things. Don't worry about it.
So Mile High Metro District has 52 churches or new church starts right now. There are 52 churches and ministries that I work with, about 70 clergy who are appointed, no, 70 clergy appointed to local churches. I think it's 68. And then a number of clergy and extension ministry. So I probably work with about 90 clergy in the district and 52 churches or new church starts. The conference I'm not as secure with. I think it's about 350 churches across the conference. I've heard that, I've been told that number a couple times, and for some reason it's the district one that sinks in for me because that's who I work with.
That's your job, right?
But yeah.
But thank you for that. Thank you.
Any other questions before we go into more information about these committees? Okay. Church council. So the church council, again, this is really wordy. I'm not going to read it all. I've highlighted some of the more important parts. Church council exists to create and supervise the strategic plan for an effective congregation. That's what church council is about. Providing or planning, implementing program of nurture, outreach, witness, resource in the local church. Leadership training, administration of the church's temporal affairs. Sorry, that's from right out of the Book of Discipline. So the point of the church council, the purpose of the church council is to create, supervise the strategic plan. Really the big picture. The church council has the responsibility of the big picture of the church and making sure that everything fits together in the big picture. They have the ultimate authority for directing mission and ministry as charged by the church conference, the charge conference. So everything the church council does, it is reportable to the charge conference meeting, the charge conference gathering once a year. So for the most part, church council is that primary entity, and then you have your meeting once a year for the charge conference. But in all reality, the church council carries out the plan of the church. So like I said, there's a lot of different stuff in here, and this is more later for anyone who wants to delve into it. Church council consists of elders, pastors. If you have deacons on staff, they're also a part of the church council. Any of your appointed staff are a part of church council. Lay leader, and the lay leader, council members, pastor form that core leadership team for the congregation. That's why those bubbles were in red. That's your core leadership team. The lay leaders, I served a church where it was a team. There were 5 or 6 of them. So churches can do different things with how they structure lay leaders. But lay leaders are the laity who also hold that big picture in a unique way. So lay leaders serve on all the different, especially administrative teams. They're kind of honed into the pulse of the church in a different way than any other laity are. In theory, and sometimes you have volunteers who don't want to serve and they're really honed into the congregation. Lay leaders have a job of representing the congregation, which is why they serve on all the different teams. They really should know the big picture of the church. SPR, they are your HR committee of the church. They are responsible for working between the staff and the congregation. Excuse me, I got a little frog in my throat. And SPR is the committee that I work the most closely with, especially in times of clergy transition or if there's staff conflict of any kind that I get invited into. The chair of SPR is an individual that I usually like to know who the chair of SPR is in all of the churches in the district. That's one of the areas that I work closely with over time. Board of Trustees, they're in charge of the property facilities. They're also the group who is legally liable for the church. They're your legal representation. And then you have the finance committee. Some churches have finance and stewardship together. Some have separate, some have a separate endowment committee. Churches can decide how they structure all the work of the finance. Oh, sorry, I don't know. Other members on church council, lay representative to annual conference. You usually have a UFW rep on church council, United Methodist Men if you have one. Every church is supposed to have a youth rep on church council representing the younger folks, a young adult rep, at-large members, membership secretary, mission and outreach. All of this can be done in different ways. I have some slides that go a little deeper into your administrative teams and the lay leader. Again, all of this is pulled out from the Book of Discipline and the guidelines. So again, I'm not going to read it, but if you're interested, this kind of goes a little deeper into it. One thing I'll say about lay leaders usually meet regularly with the pastor. Now what regular means is different in different churches. Again, they're those individuals who should have a pulse, have their finger on the pulse of the church, be able to represent both the church and have a good relationship with the pastors so that they can help carry out the vision. Any questions about the lay leader? All right. Finance, basic things about finance. They oversee stewardship unless there's a separate committee. They take care of the putting the annual budget together, administer funds. They are responsible for setting the process and procedures. So ideally, you have good financial safeguards in place. You don't have two members from the same household counting funds together. You don't have the same person signing checks as doing some of the other responsibilities. It's important to make sure that there is fiscal responsibility, fiscal safeguards. Finance committee oversees those, makes changes when needs to. That's the internal control policies. Finance reviews the reports, presents a budget. A budget is approved by church council, but finance presents the budget, is in charge of being that primary eyes over the budget through the year. Any questions specifically on finance? Trustees. Now I know you all have done a little different stuff with trustees right now, if I understand it right. Trustees oversee, maintain property. Responsible for making sure the property is safe, for updating, for making recommendations, especially when funds are needed to, if your boiler furnace breaks down, trustees are responsible. They're also responsible for the daily upkeep and care, snowplow, lawn maintenance. They're not responsible for doing it all. They're responsible for making sure it gets done. Sometimes it's hard to recruit for trustees because people don't want to be the ones that mow the lawn. Trustees just oversees getting things done. They don't have to be the ones to do it all. And as trustees, kind of this hybrid, I think that you all have of traditional committee structure and single board where trustees has rolled into your church council, you're responsible for making sure things get done, but you don't have to be the ones to do it all as the church council. That's where you put task force, or you find volunteers, or you have someone who oversees contracts. this is the team who makes sure that you have adequate insurance coverage. So trustees should know what the insurance looks like from Church Mutual, from the conference, other insurance. They should be the ones who understand what liability means. And in the leadership packet, we'll talk quickly about some forms that if you have an accident, if somebody slips and falls and has to go to the hospital, you need to have an incident report that goes
Well,
to
this thing
trustees.
started at 9, not 10. So
So that's your trustees, and now those responsibilities are within your church council. If trustees is rolled into the church council. SPR we talked about a little bit. SPRs are run kind of different in different churches, and this is where it can get it can be important for your church to understand the role of SPR, especially with a larger staff. In small churches where the only staff person is the pastor, the role of SPR is pretty easily defined. Larger churches, when you have a number of staff, the role of SPR can get a little mucky at times because SPR members are not the direct
Your
supervisors.
screen just went off.
They're not there day to day.
The screen just went off.
Yeah, I meant to stop sharing. Thanks, Dan.
Oh,
The pastor is the direct supervisor of the staff, and depending on your structure, that can be a pastor supervises certain people and other staff supervise other people. The daily supervision of staff versus the SPR supervision of staff are different, and it's important for SPR to understand that they're not the day-to-day direct supervisors. And yet, how then do they work with the pastor and the direct supervisors? I've been in churches where I alone do evaluations for the staff, and I've seen churches where you have the pastor and an SPR member do evaluations. You have to be really clear on why you're going to do it certain ways. If you have liaisons from SPR to the staff, you want to make sure that that liaison relationship doesn't get muddied by having them also be a part of evaluations, because now they almost become a supervisor rather than a liaison. You have to be careful with some SPR in larger church staffs that you're not either undermining the pastor by trying to take over supervision or staying away too much that your staff don't feel like they're supported. It's a fine line. So SPR is a super important committee for large church staff so that your staff feels supported, and so that the congregation knows if there are staffing issues, where they go to. Talk to the senior pastor, also talk to SPR members. One of the things when I do specific SPR trainings, what I always tell people, and I would actually say this to everybody, if there is an issue, especially with your pastor, and someone goes to an SPR person, the very first question should always be, have you talked to the pastor? No one in lay leadership should be taking on issues of folks if they haven't, well, really ever, but your first response should be, have you talked to the clergy person? The worst thing that can happen in a church is an SPR, church council lay leader, who tries to solve personnel issues without dealing with them directly. It can create lots of conflict. So you all, in whatever leadership positions you're in, anytime you hear frustration, questions, anything, the first question should be, have you talked to that person? Whether it's the clergy person or another staff person, have you talked to them? Have you tried to work this out one-on-one? That's always the first step. If I get a phone call from someone from a church, that's always my question. Have you talked to the clergy person? And if they say no, I don't engage the conversation. You have to first deal with stuff directly. That's the healthiest way to do it in a church, at least to begin there. And then, things can evolve in different ways. But as leadership of the church, you're probably going to have people come to you, whether it has to do with your committee or not. Folks will see you as leaders in the church and they'll come to you about a whole lot of things. It's important to be able to say, that's not what I do, and I recommend that you talk to so-and-so. In larger churches, that triangulating and the behind the scenes stuff it can happen in all size churches, but the likelihood of it is increased in larger churches. So it's important for the church to know who the SPR members are, and for other leadership to know who the SPR members are, so that if you do hear stuff and you need to go to an SPR member for something, you know who they are. Any questions about SPR? Okay, there's a whole bunch in here about a couple slides on it. Lay leadership and nominations, like I said, it's the only committee that the staff or that the clergy person chairs. But clergy person does chair lay leadership and nominations. This is the team that populates all of the other teams. So it's kind of got its own unique set of, or unique work. If you do a single board governance, this is often a team that is outside the single board governance, because there's an argument that the single board shouldn't always just be replacing themselves. You can get into some issues and questions there. So when you do have a single board, lay leadership nominations still functions independently. And then just some basic other ministry areas. I'm going to share a structure. Stop this. Do you see this? Let me enlarge it. I can enlarge it. This is an example of a single board structure. Where you have the church charge conference, like we had before. Then you have the leadership board, and they serve as your trustees, SPR, finance, stewardship, church council, all in one team. Nominations is still separate. And then the pastor oversees some ministry areas, kind of like what we talked about, children's youth, mission outreach. But rather than having those 6 separate committees, those all function, or 4 separate committees, those all function as your leadership board, your single board governance. And then the other stuff. A lot of times single board led churches then talk about task force. And so rather than having folks sign up for 3 years for children's ministry or 3 years for other ministries, you do task force as needed for different things that are happening in the church. In single board governance, they love the term task force. And so you do short-term ministry task force rather than long-term committee commitments. In the traditional committee structure, if you're not aware, it's 3 years that you usually sign up for, and then you rotate. And so you need 50 to 60 to 70 people to fill these teams in a traditional committee structure. And a lot of folks are going to single board governance if they don't have that number of people to fill, or if you keep having the same people just hopping from one committee to another. Lynn said part of why we're doing this is hopefully you'll learn something about a committee you're not on, because odds are at some point you might be on that committee. That's pretty common in a church. You get a pool of leadership and you just kind of cycle through all of the committees. It's harder and harder to do that. And so single board governance changes the number of folks that you need. But single board, there's lots of different ways to do single board. There's not just one way, and that's unique to the church. Pam, I see your question. I'll respond to you in a minute. What's interesting with you all is you have some different teams. So the ministry design team, the worship design team, is that the right names? Lynn, can you explain the ministry design team a little bit?
Yeah, the ministry design team is what we would call outreach in other churches. Ministry design is made up of all the people who are doing outreach ministry. like UMW, youth, the people who are going out in the community and doing things. And the purpose is to coordinate that work so that we don't spread ourselves too thin and our resources too thin, and also to coordinate fundraising for the church so that we don't have 10 fundraising campaigns that all happen in May, which is not healthy. It's not good for the people. It's not good for what you end up having is people staying away from the church in May because they're not stupid and they get the idea that this is when we're going to be asking for extra money. So that's what the ministry design is, to coordinate the outward focused ministries of the church and to keep the vision of the church in front of everyone, to make sure that that we are all rowing in the same direction. And then the worship design team is to coordinate worship. That's pretty obvious. I was confused when I first started. I got ministry design and worship design confused all the time. And I thought, oh, they were two names for the same committee, but they are not. The ministry is the outward focus, and the worship design is really about what we do on Sundays and for special services.
Okay.
Did
So
that
when we talk about, oh,
Did that explain?
yeah.
Okay.
When we talk about how teams work together, I did see the question. We don't have an org chart right now for Hope's current design. That's something that I hope to put in this before we send it out. I'm still kind of learning some of the unique stuff about Hope, and so wanted to talk through some things here before we put that org chart. And it could be kind of a, this is as it is now, as of this date, or this is how it has been. I know there were some different questions at times. I know with trustees going into church council, it's a little different than most of your org charts. But really how the committees work together is through your church council. That's the most common way that that committees share what's happening and learn what's happening from other teams, is those church council meetings. It depends on who all are members of your church council. But part of what we talked about is this leadership handbook. And this will be a way to help folks work together. So I'm going to share this. Again, this is a super early draft. This originates out of St. Luke's United Methodist Church, which is where I was for a while. And so I passed on that leadership handbook to Lynn. She's taken a look at it. In many ways made it unique to Hope, but you'll still see some St. Luke stuff in it on the screen. So Lynn's going to work with church council on finalizing a handbook that then goes to all committee members, that helps folks understand what they're doing when. So right now, we're not going to show, that's not what you wanted. You probably didn't care about my notes for this meeting. Here we go. So it's a really kind of the beginning, unique to Hope, the mission of Hope. You kind of start off with that, who the staff are, and then get into, this is often what people don't know how to do. And our new communications director, this might be of interest to you, letting folks know what communications at Hope looks like and how to put things, if you have information that needs to go out, how you do that. Sometimes we forget that not everybody knows all of those things, and we assume that people know what they need to be doing. A handbook like this actually tells people, if there are deadlines, it needs to be in by Tuesday at noon. It needs to go here, it needs to go there. So Hope Happenings, Words of Hope, the website, Facebook, social media, slides, bulletin, posters, all of the different ways that Hope communicates internally and externally will be in the handbook for folks to understand how to be a part of that, what to do. If you need to request space, at Hope. If you need childcare for a function or a meeting, what that looks like, how you request it, what kind of the rules are around it. If you need building use request, there'll be an example of a form. Funding your ministry. Lynn talks about this a little bit. I don't know if you've ever been at a church. I don't know if Hope has done this in the past. I have been in churches where every week it seems like there's a different fundraiser and that none of it's coordinated, or you'll have 1 month where you have 10 fundraisers and then you have nothing else for 3 months. Having a fundraiser policy can be really important because otherwise the congregation gets burnt out on fundraisers. And so some basic policies are really important that everyone understands and understands the purpose behind them. But if you want a fundraiser, what are the steps for your ministry team? How do you function that way? Here's the incident reporting procedures. If somebody falls and has to go by ambulance, or if somebody falls and hurts themselves, or if something happens, making sure that the right people know, and that's usually the trustees. Now it would be the church council. And then other things that you could include in here: an evacuation plan, a map of the building so folks know what's going on. You could put all kinds of stuff in a leadership handbook, which is a great resource, because then if you can't remember how you're supposed to do something, you actually have the resource. You have to find it. Sometimes that can be a problem, but you have it if you need to figure something out. So that's in process, and Hope can kind of do what you all want with it. It was just one of the ideas that I shared with Lynn. Lynn and I also talked about for SPR coming up with a liaison job description so that the liaisons are really clear about what their roles are and what their roles are not. Sometimes that's just as important. I feel like that's a lot of information that I've thrown at you. What questions are there? Julie and then Stan.
I have a question about going to the quarterly newsletter instead of bi-monthly. So the deadline for the March newsletter is February 15th. Is that correct?
So the quarter, want to chime in? Go ahead.
Go ahead, Allison. Take it.
Oh, well, it's really going to be Wendy's, but I thought we had, it was March 15th is the deadline for the April, May, June Words of Hope. And
I can't hear Allison at all.
Okay, I'll say what she's saying. First of all, the handbook is just something that I threw together. So this hasn't been vetted with everybody else and their dates and what they want. So this will come out with correct dates in it. So don't look at the due dates right now. This is a work in progress. Our new director of communications, who is Wendy Wall, will be the one setting all of that. But I'm not 100% sure that we have decided when the newsletters are going to come out and when the best time is for the flow of what's going on. Like we had talked about having something for April, May, June, but if we do April, May, June, we're missing all of Lent. And so we need to have a Lent document. And so maybe this year we'll start it. I don't know yet is the short answer. And what Allison was talking about was having an April, May, June newsletter with the due date of, it would be the 15th of the preceding month if we do in April, May, June. And so Wendy, what were you thinking about doing?
That was my understanding, but I'm flexible at this point. So, but for quarterly, it would be an April newsletter would be the next one. And I realized that we're missing, well, my understanding is there wasn't a newsletter for January and February because I wasn't in place yet.
Right.
So,
right.
Yeah.
But so this year might be a little bit different. If we go quarterly according to calendar, then yes, January, February, March, April, May, June, that makes a lot of sense. But if we go by Christian season, And maybe that will make sense going forward. And in January, it would make sense to have all of this stuff in place. I mean, I don't know yet if that's going to work. And we really need to make that decision at staff and include the music team and make sure that everybody feels like, I know Larry and Cheryl work so far in advance. They could probably have all of their Easter stuff ready to publicize and promote on January 1st, but some other teams might not be able to do that. So we're going to have to talk about the due dates for all of these things and make sure that it works for everybody.
So if I have things to go in the next newsletter regarding, for instance, the Hill scholarship funds and the applications for those and deadlines for those.
And what's your timeline on that, Julie?
Well, in the past, we've had an April 15th deadline. I mean, we can change that. It doesn't have to be that, but we've usually then announced it sometime in May or the first part of June. But we have to have time to get the applications in and, you know.
Julie, I would probably use Hope Happenings as your main form of communication, because it can go out every Wednesday. So you can choose like the 3 or 4 Wednesdays before you want the things. I think that's going to be your main form. And then if you're worried about not hitting someone from the past, maybe you could reach out to like past recipients or kids you know are still in school. But I would probably use Hope Happenings as your main form and not the newsletter.
Good idea, Kate.
And Julie, at one point recently, and I know it's been in the last 3 or 4 years, when Stacy was youth director, there was kind of a decision made that scholarships needed to be awarded in May so that the checks could be written to the universities rather than.
Our checks for the Hill Scholarship go to the individuals, not to the university.
Yeah, the Hills are a little different, but also I would use Ken and his email list. I would do Hope Happenings and then send an announcement to Ken so that he can send it out in his youth emails. I think you'll have better success there anyway, but that way you don't have to worry because those things are going out all the time.
And we can also put that kind of thing on the website so that it gets a broader viewership for folks to see. You can put the application and have a link. Wendy can make a link for it on the website so that it lives there.
They're there presently.
And is all the information we've done in the past, the application forms and all of that, is that still on somebody's website or somebody's computer?
All the scholarships are on the website. Applications have been updated to reflect 2022. Preliminary information has already gone out in the youth email as well. And we've been coordinating with Pam, our treasurer, on the best way to do that to avoid taxes to students to make sure that it's scholarship. So meeting with your committee and things like that. So I'm sorry that you were not looped in on that conversation, but you and I can talk more about that if you would like.
And then Julie, doing it that way, then all you'd need to do to put in the weekly email on the Hope Happenings would be the link to the website, that information, and that fits very well with the size of message you want to put on the Hope Happenings. So,
Dan, you had your hand up.
Thank you.
I wanted to know why finance and stewardship were combined, as well as why church council and trustees committees were combined. Was it to streamline it or to have less committees?
Finance and stewardship are sometimes combined. I don't know if they are at Hope or not specifically.
They didn't used to be.
yeah, it hasn't been, and that has been, it was explained to me that was the responsibility of the pastor. And when Carrie and I met and I was talking to her, I would really like to put it back with finance. Now, it doesn't have to be the finance committee doing that. There can be a subgroup. Finance can say, we don't want it. We want a separate stewardship group. But and that's okay, however Hope wants to do it. The beauty of the Methodist system, now I'm channeling Jessica a little bit here, but the beauty of the Methodist system is with so many different churches, in so many different settings, urban, rural, suburban, extension ministries, it's hard in discipline to make a rule that's going to fit for everybody. So our discipline leaves us a lot of leeway to do things as we need to do for our setting. So the order of the church is something we can decide together what works the best. And if Hope and the finance committee and Carrie says, yes, absolutely, we want stewardship to be separate, then yes, let's do that. But it really, lay leadership should own that stewardship piece. And then to answer your other question about trustees rolling into church council, it is an experiment that church council and trustees, the trustee chair and our lay leader decided to try this year to see if we could move toward the one board governance, which is what had been discussed years ago before you got here, before Claire was here. It had been discussed quite a few years ago, moving to this simplified structure. So we talked about it and talked about it and talked about it and decided to have this experiment of trying it with just trustees to see if it would work.
Lynn, may I give a very, very good example of why we decided to do this?
Perfect.
According to discipline, trustees have to roll off every 3 years. Well, you don't want to roll off your best guy on HVAC or your best guy on security. So by putting the administration of trustees on church council and having a work team that is not required to move off, you can keep your experts working on your facility and only your administrators move off. And you get new people who have been on church council doing trustee stuff. That is a concrete reason why we're trying this.
And thank you, Patty Jo, exactly. And as we discussed how this would work best, the trustees rolling into church council, that involves Allison. And so everyone who was at the table said Allison could, because she's there, and because she has knowledge of what's going on in the building, she knows what lights are out. She works with Charlie every day. She knows the window that's broken. She knows whether the parking lot was plowed or not. She's dealing with all of those people that she would be a logical person to chair the buildings and grounds team that's doing the hands-on work there. And then Patty Jo, as chair of church council, is chairing the legal and administrative functions of the trustee committee. And so that's why Allison is now full-time and why she has that new title and all of those things. Melissa, did you want to ask a question?
Yeah, my question is, when you have a larger trustees issue, you know, in the past you could say like, okay, we need a new furnace. We're going to go to the furnace guy. Now we go to Allison and she directs us to whoever takes that control, who needs to go to that issue. That's my question. Speaking specifically because of a playground project that is going to take many, many man hours, and poor Allison should frankly not be in, like, I'm not trying to deny you, Allison, but it's too much for even for us. So like, how does that work when you have larger projects that are going to take an extended period of time and a lot of hands-on work?
Well, ideally, and that's an excellent question. Thank you, Melissa. I love the way your brain works. I really do. I know sometimes you feel like it's not working, but I really admire your brain power. Yes. So ideally, what would happen? Yes, you could go to Allison. Allison would say, this is beyond the scope of what I can handle in the hours that I have. And that would then go to church council, who could decide to make a task force, as we're using that phrase, make a task force to oversee the playground, the building of the playground, and to work with PDO on that specific project. And that wouldn't have to be somebody from church council. That could be church council and clergy and even staff saying, gosh, these people would be the best people for that task force, so that we have the best people doing the work.
We did similar things with the sound system and the projection system. In the sanctuary, we had a special task force that handled that. We did the same thing when we did our renovation. We had a special group of people who handled that. Basically, outside of any of our committees, we pulled in a special task force to work on that. So yeah, that's a model that we have used before. We'll pull it in for this one too.
So I've got a quick question. And again, I apologize for my sound. Can you hear me?
Hear you better now, yes.
Okay, good. So with Melissa's very good point, for something like that, and it's not that we run into huge projects every week, but what should Melissa's logical steps be? Approach me and I bring it to church council, go for Melissa to go directly to a church council meeting, or create some sort of request? What would be a good step-by-step process?
Yeah, and I think that's going to be something we're not going to be able to say absolutely for every situation that comes up. So, you know, that either you or Patty Jo, and I think something like this playground would be something that really church council, that you would say, if somebody comes to you, you would say, you know, I have this limited budget to take care of these day-to-day things, and that's beyond the budget. So that really should go to Patty Jo. And so that may be something, I really think that this is a church council decision, the playground. But there are going to be other things that are going to come up, Allison, that people are going to ask you about. And one of the things I want to say, Chris is saying that he has to get off and Kate has to get off. Some folks are going to start dropping off. But one of the things that happened in that meeting where we decided to try this experiment, when they talked about you, Allison, was they said, she has the bandwidth to be able to discern whether or not this is something she should or could handle, and then refer it to church council. So that trust was placed in you too, which I think is really nice.
You know, I might add here that one way to discriminate between what goes where is remember the term day-to-day. So if it's a day-to-day issue that's going to require one of our routine vendors, that's Allison all the way. She knows exactly how to do that. She also is not afraid to ask questions. So if she's not certain, is that something she should cover, then she'll ask and get some feedback. If it's a capital project, I mean, the playground's a good example. If it's a capital project, PDO has to be involved. Actually, the state licensing folks have rules about that, and the church has to be involved. So that becomes a project, and that sort of goes beyond Allison's day-to-day. She can lead somebody to the right place, but if it's that kind of a project, there's no question that it becomes a bigger deal, so it becomes a church council thing. So maybe that's one way to help figure out who's on first.
I would also add, if there's a budget for it within trustees, that's one thing. If this is something that's now going to go into trustees reserve, that's an entirely different question.
So that goes along with the day-to-day. Usually the day-to-day, there is a budget for in trustees. The big project. Chris, that's a great way to think about it. The day-to-day versus a bigger project changes where it lands. Yeah.
And we have a PDO board. And so this might be something that the PDO board, which has church representation on it, could handle. So there are going to be several different scenarios that are going to come up that are going to bring up this question, and they might not all fit neatly into one category or the other, but I'm really confident that the people who are overseeing their areas will be able to work together to figure out who's going to take the ball and run with it.
Dan, I wanted to go back to your question about finance and stewardship. One thing to keep in mind is the finance committee is responsible for stewardship according to the book of discipline, but they're not responsible necessarily for doing it. So in some churches, finance does also do the stewardship campaigns. In other churches, it's a whole different committee. When you have separate committees, though, you have to have a finance rep on stewardship and a stewardship rep on finance, because those two teams, if they're separate, should be working together really, really closely. The last thing you want is a stewardship committee that goes off and does its own thing and doesn't fit into the financial needs of the church. The stewardship team can never function independently of everything else. Pastor, it's a really important work of the church, and it's got to be in conjunction with finance and with the clergy person, which is why it's the ultimate responsibility of the finance team. But it doesn't have to be the same team. They often are. In smaller churches, finance and stewardship are the same team, just because you don't have the personnel to staff two separate committees. In larger churches, they're often a separate committee, but work closely together. So for discipline, it's the same team. But as Lynn said, discipline says, figure out your own structure that works for your church.
And Carrie, did you want to speak to that?
Yeah, so, and it's something that I think this year it makes sense that it is combined. I'm thankful that it is. We've got a lot of work cut out for us, but I think especially with the new structure of finance and financial secretary, the finance committee can definitely handle at Hope doing both.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
There are a couple questions I want to touch base on. I know we're at 10:30. True, you mentioned UMW working with other church units. If you have not connected with the new district chair, Marcia Cantor, or president, I would encourage you.
Yes, I have. And we're having a meeting this afternoon. So
yeah, that's one of her goals as well. So
right. I know that.
Okay. Yeah. So in any way that I can be brought in, or if you have questions for me, True.
I just wanted to bring that up because as the communication goes out to the churches, out to our own church, all of a sudden we're cooperating with St. Luke's or with Grace or something like that, and what's going on.
Okay. It's a goal for me that our churches do work cooperatively in lots of different ways, whether it's UMW, some of the IDI work, just helping in committee structure. I mean, we have clergy who can resource other churches on a number of different things. So I value when our churches work together cooperatively rather than competitively, which there has been some of that in the past. Especially some of our larger churches. I know Hope and Littleton and St. Andrew and St. Luke's. I served St. Luke, so I know there are folks who will rotate amongst those churches. How it is that we work cooperatively strengthens all of the churches. So UMW is one aspect of that. But other questions, like I said, this is just an intro. This is a beginning. If we were doing this in person, it would be a 3-hour thing. We would go deeper into each of the teams. That's really hard to do on Zoom. So this is a first step of what will be some follow-up internally within Hope of some training, some education, figuring out ways to work together. This experiment of rolling trustees into church council, I love that you all are willing to experiment. And whether it stays that way or not, you're willing to experiment and see if there's a more effective way to do church leadership. That's fantastic. So Stan?
Where would be a resource to find out how the Methodist Church decided to change the definition of elders and deacons and have committees make the decisions for the Methodist Church? Is that on Google?
I'm not quite sure I understand your question. We changed the elder and deacon, I think 1996, 2000. So you can go back and read when we created the two different orders, elder and deacon, and what went into that.
You go where?
You can get online probably and just search United Methodist elder versus deacon. I could also explain some of it to you in a different conversation if that could take an hour explaining why that happened and how that happened. But what do you mean about committees making decisions?
Well, in other churches, elders and deacons make the decisions. In the Methodist Church, committees make the decisions. So I just wonder how that was decided, but that's such a large question. I'll probably have to go to another resource to look that up.
Well,
So
Stan,
there are also, go ahead.
I'm
Liz.
sorry, Jessica, Rev Ken and I can help you with that a little bit. And you have to keep in mind that in other churches, the word elder means something completely different than what it means in the United Methodist Church. That in other churches, an elder is a layperson.
Right.
And in the United Methodist Church, the elders are ordained. So that's apples and oranges. But Rev Ken and I have a little bit of that history, and there's the Book of Resolutions and all of these other things that we could point you in the right direction on that.
Okay, thank you.
And some of that really dates back to John Wesley and the founding of Methodism and the philosophy behind strong lay leadership. So you can find all kinds of history books that can tell you about how that came to be. But yeah, Lynn and Ken can talk you through all that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I love that you're asking those questions. Jane.
So my question is not so much on leadership at Hope, but how do you get involved in leadership at the district and the annual conference level? Because I've gone on the Mountain Sky website, and to be honest, I haven't found it necessarily very user-friendly on where to find resources. And while this year I might not be able to get involved as much as I would like to in the district and the annual conference because of my commitments at Hope, in the future, I would like to do that.
I love that question. So one of the first things you can do is talk to Rev Lynn or Rev Ken, and they can begin a conversation about what are your gifts, what are your interests, where would you like to get involved? Or you can contact me. You know, we have a couple different district committees. We have our district committee on ministry, which works with candidates who are going into clergy leadership of different varieties. We're always looking for good lay representation on DCOM. We have the roundtable, we have the building and location, and then we have a number of different teams at the conference level. And so if you're interested, just reach out to Rev Lynn, Rev Ken, myself, and we can have conversations about where you would serve, where you would fit well, and what that would look like. And I agree, our website's horrible, and they're redoing it. I know, yes, we have a new communications director at the conference level as well, and so she knows our website is horrible. So any questions, just reach out, Lynn, Ken, or myself. But now that you're on my radar, Jane, I'll be thinking.
Mm-hmm.
Other questions? Someone asked about an org chart for Hope. So I'll work with Lynn and put in this PowerPoint presentation a current Hope org chart. So that'll be part of what we add to this before we send it out to everybody. If there's anything else that you would find helpful that we can add to this, talk with Rev Lynn or Rev Ken, and we can work on kind of putting a final version of this that goes out publicly. Jane?
Sorry, now that I reserved my right to ask questions, I have a gazillion of them. So are we going to plan on doing some additional training to maybe do a deeper dive?
Yes.
Okay.
The short answer is yes. I'm going to work with our lay leaders. Brent is forearmed. And hopefully they will be heavily involved in helping to organize the next training sessions based on what they've heard our needs are here at this session. Yeah.
Yeah, because I know that for SPRC, that a lot of us would love to have training on what a liaison exactly is and what we are not.
So a couple of things too. I want to say Hope does have an organizational chart. To go back to that question, it does not reflect how the church actually is working. And now it really doesn't, now that we have trustees rolled into church council. So that needs to be updated. And I think that can happen, as Jessica said, pretty quickly. So that will, but also the upcoming training is, we had talked in SPRC about getting training in communication. We had talked about doing some more in-depth about what each of the committees do, maybe just for the specific committees. So there are lots of ways we can do that, but I want to talk with the lay leaders first and get their buy-in. If you know anything about me now, you have to know that I like collaborative rather than top-down. And I believe in strong lay leadership for any church, regardless of the size. With our, as Jessica said, with our structure of our rotating revolving door pastors, the stronger the lay leadership can be. And the more you work together and understand the process of how you've decided you want to work together, the less our coming and going is going to affect the life of the church, which that's my goal. That is my goal here right now at Hope, is to help strengthen up the order of the church so that pastors coming and going is not going to matter to you. I mean, you'll love us, of course you do, but that you'll be able to just keep carrying on and eventually be able to say to the pastor, here, you know, here's our structure, here's our organizational chart, here's our leadership handbook, here's our employee, here's all the stuff that we've created of how we want to do things. Yeah, and especially if you go to the single board governance, is that you can ask your district superintendent, when you find out that your pastor's losing her mind and can no longer function in a leadership position, you can say to your DS, we need a new pastor, but we have to have one that understands single board governance, or that's going to be able to work with us in this hybrid model. And because you have lay leadership that's working with the DS and has a relationship with the DS, she's already going to know what that's like. So it's all for your benefit. That's strength in community.
I will say for SPR, there is I don't remember if it's 6 hours or 9 hour training session on our Crossroads, the conference Crossroads that Jeff Rainwater, who's the superintendent of Church Vitality, put together. So if SPR really wants a training, it's a 6-session, 9-session, I don't remember exactly, in-depth training for SPR. So I think we can get that to you. I think you have to get on Crossroads. I don't know that we can get it outside of Crossroads, which is a software platform that we use. So if SPR wants a training, I can get you an in-depth 9-hour training, 9-session training, and folks can kind of skim through it. You don't have to spend 9 hours in this thing, but it really covers all kinds of different stuff. We don't have that depth of training for all of the committees, but we do have it for SPR.
So Jessica, one year we did that at DCOM, not DCOM, excuse me, at MDAC, at the Metro District Annual Conference. We had breakout sessions after lunch where this is on SPRC, this is on lay leadership, this is on nomination. We did that. Is there any chance of doing something like that again?
Not so much this year, but in the future it could be.
Okay.
A lot of the trainings that we're doing now are more digital so that folks can take it into their setting and you don't have to bring everybody together at one time. And this year's district gathering, we didn't know if it was going to be in person or Zoom really until we met last week. So we didn't plan too big of we're not doing breakouts after lunch. We're not doing lunch. I mean, that's part of it. You're still not doing meals. So we don't have that for this year. But that's interesting. I remember those.
Yeah.
Now that you say that, it's been a while since we've had those around here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Stan.
While I agree, lay leadership needs to be strong. So if the pastors come and go, that helps. But with Hope, we've gone through so many pastors. And it's really difficult for Hope, our church, to keep having to go through so many ministers. It's disruptive and it's difficult because you become a friend of the pastors or ministers, and then they leave and go somewhere else. And how difficult it must be for like Rev Lynn or Don Bird or Claire to keep going to different churches. It's not that easy on people either, even though lay leadership needs to be strong in any case. So I'm telling this to you, Jessica, because I'm hoping Rev Lynn can stay with us for a while.
Hey, I'm hoping that too. I have no intention of moving her right now. Our structure, when we say yes to being an ordained elder, we say yes to itinerancy. We know that as clergy, we've said yes to this from the very beginning. We know that's going to be a part of our life. And so we're prepared for that. We're appointed for a year at a time. I don't know if you understand that.
Yeah.
Clergy are appointed for 1 year at a time, which means every year there could be a move. That is not our goal. We know it's disruptive for a church to move clergy too often. We know that. When you have a lot of movement in a short period of time, it's usually for kind of extenuating circumstances, unusual circumstances. So right now, all I can personally tell you, I think Rev Lynn, Rev Ken are a good team. Things are going well. They've both asked to stay. The church has asked both to stay. And so they're not on Hope is not on my list of any change come this summer. I can't make a promise because we can never make a promise to a church in a year, but there's no intention right now of movement of the two of them. And I think there's lots of good work going on. I think doing these trainings, I think getting some structure set, folks understanding, all of that is really positive, not just for right now, but for this team working together for the years to come. So Stan, I know it's disruptive. I've the life I've lived for 20 years. I understand that. And so it's never our goal to disrupt. It's never what the cabinet wants to do, seeks to do. Oftentimes it is the unusual situations that have as much movement as you all have had in the last 5 years. So my goal is stability for you all, short-term, long-term stability, which I know means you keep a pastoral team for a little while for, and what that time frame is, I can't make any promises about, but I hear you. I know.
And Stan, we have mandatory retirement at 72.
Yeah.
So that means I really could only serve for another 7 years.
Well, that'd be longer than most of them we have.
Just so you know.
Hey, anytime a church says, please don't move our pastor, I count that as a good thing. So I love hearing that. That's great. I know we are now almost at 2 hours, and I think you all committed to 1.5 hours. So thank you for sticking around. I am willing to stick around as long as people have questions, but don't want you to feel like you have to stay. As Lynn said, there's going to be follow-up with more training in the individual teams. We'll put an org chart together. I saw a comment about an org chart, maybe with some descriptions. So we'll work on how to get this out in the most helpful, useful way as quickly as possible. So folks have this to reflect back on. And it's a work in progress. If things are not helpful, we can take it out too. So just know, I mean, I'm not, it's not a baby that I'm going to be offended if you say throw the whole thing out. But whatever's helpful is what's important. So Pam, I see you waving. Now you're muted.
He's waving bye-bye.
Are you waving bye-bye?
Right?
Okay, sorry.
Yeah.
Bye, Pam.
Yeah.
Well, any final questions? And really, if anything comes up, feel free to reach out to me at any time. I try to be available, not just to the leadership, but I mean, you can reach out, you can email, especially if you have general conference questions, or Stan, if you want to know history of the Methodist Church, I will talk. I would love to talk to folks. So anything that you need, let me know. But Lynn and Ken can walk you through all kinds of stuff. They are your
What's
best.
your email?
I would just like to welcome Wendy to our team because Wendy has been a real help this last week for me. Thank you, Wendy.
I am putting my email in the chat. It's super easy. Just jrooks, mountainskyumc.org, mtnskyumc.org. All right. Well, Lynn, would you close us in prayer?
Absolutely. Gracious God, go with us, stay with us, lead us, guide us, that everything we do and say may bring this world closer into your community of love. Through Jesus Christ, we pray. Amen.
Man.
Thank you all. Thanks for being here.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
Nice to meet you all. Have a good day.
Love you, Wendy.
Love you too. Bye.
So thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. That was so amazing.
Good.
And let me stop the recording.